Hello, friends. So today what we're doing is we're talking about Strawson's paper on freedom and resentment. Before we get to that, what I want to do first is give a big picture view of how Strawson fits in with what we've talked about this week and what we're talking about the course as a whole. And then I'll give a sort of broad overview of what Strawson's up to in this paper. So, and yes, I did get a haircut. Thank you for noticing. Anyway, so what are we doing here? Question we ask ourselves every day. So you recall that we started out this course with the packaged view, right? That human beings are have disembodied minds, they're rational, we're free in the sense of being unmoved movers, and we are asocial / agender. Cool. So this week we've been challenging that element that we are free in the sense of being unmoved movers. So we saw with Spinoza, for example, that Spinoza thinks that that's just garbage, right? That we are thoroughly determined. Why? Because we are manifestations of God, right? And because God is necessary, and what proceeds from God necessarily, and because we proceed from God, everything we do, everything we manifest about God is itself necessary. Right? So that's the first bit. Second bit, we looked at Hume. Right? Implicit in the picture from the received view, or the packaged view, is that if we are free, then that excludes the truth of determinism, right? That is, that free will and determinism are incompatible. And what we find in Hume is the claim not only that they are compatible, but rather that we need both free will and determinism in order to make sense of ideas about responsibility. What we find today in Strawson is, in a sense, a reframing of the question. So yes, Strawson thinks that we can hold people responsible and determinism might be true, right? But more importantly, or the reason why I think Strawson is worth reading, is because he has us reconsider the worthwhile character of the question, are we free? So ordinarily, right, we typically think about free will coming first and then responsibility coming second. So in other words, we have an understanding of responsibility in terms of free will. What Strawson tells us is that we can have a standalone idea of responsibility independent of an idea about free will. Or if you want to put it this way, you could say that for the ordinary view, right, for most folks, I mean including Spinoza and including Hume, free will, we ask about free will first, and then we ask about responsibility. For Strawson, we ask about responsibility, and then we ask questions about determinism and free will, right? Responsibility comes conceptually first for us. How does he do this? Well, he offers us a compatibilist view that's called reactive attitudes theory, or has come to be known as reactive attitude theory. So reactive attitudes, in short, are ways that we respond to others. And he offers us a few categories of ways in which we respond to others. And he considers believing the truth of determinism in light of these particular categories of responses to others. So, with that by way of preamble, let's dive into Strawson's discussion. So, he sets up the problem for himself by posing a debate between pessimists and optimists. So pessimists say if determinism is true, then our concepts of responsibility and obligation make no sense. And it's kind of easy to see how this works. So for the pessimist, if we think if determinism turns out to be right, then we can't really make sense of the idea of responsibility. Why is that? Well, imagine this scenario. Imagine that you're walking down the street in beautiful downtown Spokane, and somebody comes up behind you, unbeknownst to you, grabs your hands, and makes you start slapping the person next to you. Now, in this case, we clearly don't hold you responsible for slapping the person next to you, right? It's the dude behind you who grabbed your hands that's responsible, right? Or rather, the dude behind you who grabbed your hands made you slap you, right? Made you slap the other person, right? That's why you slap the other person. So we don't hold you responsible because you had no say in the action. So that's the idea for the pessimist, that if determinism turns out to be true, then every action is like the dude coming up behind us, grabbing our hands, making us slap somebody else silly. Now, the optimist, on the other hand, says that even if determinism turns out to be true, then we can still make sense of our concepts of responsibility and obligation. Why is that? Well, because our concepts of responsibility and obligation are largely social concepts, or rather, more precisely, they're socially efficacious concepts. What do we mean by that? Well, quick sidebar. One way in which we do philosophy, or one way to make progress on philosophical questions, is to ask what certain concepts do for us, right? What's the value of having certain concepts? So in this case, we're asking about the value of the concept of responsibility. That is to say, by having the idea of responsibility, what are some of the things we can do, or what are some of the things we can think about if we didn't have that concept? Right? So by engaging in this sort of a thought experiment, we get some insight onto the nature of the concept of responsibility. All right, back on track. So what does the concept of responsibility let us do? Well, one of the things that responsibility does is it lets us, not to put too fine a point on it, it lets us manipulate and control others. So in other words, it's a socially efficacious concept. How might that work? Well, suppose I catch a student cheating on an exam. Well, so clearly this student is going to be punished. So what does punishing the student do? Well, what it does is it allows me to, in a sense, make an example of the student, right? I get to hold up the student and say, this is what happens when you cheat, don't cheat. And so holding responsible allows me to sort of control others, right? Not in any sort of devious sense, because we do this all the time. But we encourage socially beneficial behavior, and we discourage socially disadvantageous behaviors, right? Things we don't want. So, the optimist says, even if determinism is true, our concept of responsibility does good work for us. And so we can still make sense of our ideas of responsibility and of obligation. So, what's the problem then? Well, we have this disagreement between the pessimist and the optimist. Now, the pessimist makes his case that if we're determined, we can't make sense of responsibility. The optimist has made her case, right, that if we are determined, then we can still make sense of the idea of responsibility. And the optimist makes her case by saying that the concept of responsibility is a socially useful concept. We use it to help encourage and discourage certain behaviors. So how does the pessimist respond to this? Well, the pessimist responds by saying that the idea of responsibility that the optimist is working with isn't our ordinary sense of responsibility, right? When we talk about responsibility, or when we think about responsibility, we don't think primarily of social control. What's an example? Well, suppose I do catch a student cheating on an exam. Why do I want to hold that student responsible? What motivates me to hold that student responsible? Well, what motivates me are features about the student, right? Features about the student's desires, the student's will. What is not at the forefront of my mind in doing that what's not in the forefront of my mind is the usefulness of holding the student responsible. Sure, there is some sort of social utility to holding people responsible, or holding the student responsible in this case, right? But that's not why I do it, right? I don't do it to make an example of the student. I do it because the student shouldn't be doing it, right? Because it's wrong to choose that way. But notice this, we hold people responsible because it's wrong to choose that way. And that seems to strongly imply the falsity of determinism. Because if you make a choice because you have to make that choice, then in what sense is it really a choice, right? Right now I'm going to take a sip of water. Laws of physics say that water is going to go downhill once the bottle is turned a certain way. I guess you could say the water chooses to do it, but that doesn't really reflect our ordinary ideas about choice. So, in the same way, even if, when we talk about the student choosing, we imply by that the student we imply by that that the student is doing something of her own free will or his own free will, right, which is inconsistent with the truth of determinism. So, what the pessimist says is, grant the optimist her ideas about determinism and responsibility. Well, the sense whatever the optimist is then talking about with respect to responsibility isn't what we usually think of with respect to responsibility. Right? That's not how we ordinarily think about responsibility or ordinarily talk about it. So, what Strawson is interested in doing is rehabilitating that optimist position, that even if determinism is true, if it should turn out that it's true, then our concepts of responsibility and obligation remain unaffected. And so that's what we're going to get to in the next lecture, is unpacking Strawson's ideas